Greetings to my students of classical mythology. Today we are going to discuss the foundation behind Aeschylus' Agamemnon, a Greek tragedy that you read this week on your own. And we're going to talk about the house of Atreus. Atreus is a name which is mentioned throughout the Agamemnon, but for which you might not have had tremendous context. So during this video, I'm going to talk to you about the house of Atreus and provide the mythological context and the backstory that provides a lot of context and meaning towards what's happening in the house of Agamemnon. We're also going to discuss some major themes in Aeschylus' Agamemnon, or at least flag them up for later discussion. One of those themes is the question of the intersection between divine and human justice. How do these two forms of justice come together, and to what extent are divine and human justice harmonized or cacophonous in this play? We'll also be looking at gendered forms of violence. This is a play that is part of a larger trilogy called the Oresteia, and we'll be seeing different acts of violence throughout the three plays that are interpreted very differently based on the genders of the people who enact and receive murders in this trilogy. We're also going to talk about domestic space, the home space, and its interactions with the Trojan War. And this is going to be a theme for us, not only within the context of Agamemnon and the Oresteia, but also when we look at the Odyssey and certain other texts that we will examine this semester. So what happens to the domestic space after the Trojan War? How is home transformed in different ways for different heroes who were at Troy? Another theme we'll discuss is familial miasma. Miasma is a Greek word that refers to a religious form of pollution, and that form of pollution is coursing through the house of Atreus because of its own long history of cycles of violence and bloodshed and a family curse that's resulted from those, and the way that violence keeps reiterating itself in cycle after cycle in new generations of this family. So what is going on with this pollution? How does it operate within the story? And how can it ultimately be purified? Finally, we'll be looking at the concept of divine retribution for human acts, and how divine retribution sometimes works through both human and non-human agents. So the gods use themselves, but they also use human characters to facilitate acts of retribution. And this is a play that has a lot to do with betrayal and revenge. The Agamemnon is about the betrayal or revenge that Clytemnestra takes on her husband Agamemnon for having murdered or sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia. And Aeschylus, her partner in crime, is also getting some vengeance against Agamemnon for intergenerational acts of violence that he wants vengeance for. So let's take a look at the family tree in the line of Tantalus, so that you have a greater visual sense of how Agamemnon and Clytemnestra fit into this larger family tree. And I've taken the liberty of highlighting the characters whose names will come up today and in our future discussions in a major way, so that you can start to distinguish what's functionally significant to this story in a baseline way and what characters are not as important to memorize the names of right now for these purposes. So in the line of Tantalus, you'll notice that let me get my laser pointer here. Laser pointer. Okay, so Zeus is at its head, and Zeus is the king of the universe. And so if Zeus is at the foundation of Agamemnon's family and Menelaus's family, we see them down here, Agamemnon and Menelaus, we can also therefore notice that Zeus's divine rulership serves to endow these kings with a certain form of divine connection. So the divine rule of kings as a concept we can see being exemplified in the fact that Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks in the Trojan War, is descended from Zeus, the king of the gods. Okay, so Zeus, as we've seen before, this little equals sign means procreation. So Zeus procreates with a nymph called Pluto, not to be confused with Pluto, which is another name for Hades. Pluto here is the name for a nymph, and they beget a mortal son named Tantalus. Tantalus has two children. One is Niobe and the other is Pelops. Pelops is going to come into the story. Pelops marries Hippodamia, and the two children that Pelops begets that are important for us today are Thyestes and Atreus. So when you've heard the name House of Atreus, it's really, maybe you could call it the House of Tantalus or the House of Zeus, but Atreus is the name that usually defines his family tree. And Atreus and Thyestes are brothers. We're going to talk about their conflict. Thyestes is the father of Aegisthus. Aegisthus is Clytemnestra's partner in crime for the murder of Agamemnon. And so now looking at this chart, you can see that Aegisthus is actually Agamemnon's uncle. And then the children of Agamemnon that will be relevant in the next three plays are Orestes and Electra, who are still alive, and Iphigenia, who is the one whom Agamemnon sacrificed to the goddess Artemis in order to facilitate proper winds to blow the Greek ships to Troy. So he sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia. You can practice saying it with me. Iphigenia, or Iphigenia is also another pronunciation option. So that is what Clytemnestra situates as the reason for her vengeance against Agamemnon, because Agamemnon sacrificed their own daughter, so she kills him. And then Aegisthus has his own vengeance that he wants to get against Agamemnon due to the other sort of intergenerational family strife that this group is a part of. Okay, so the House of Atreus. Let's start with Tantalus, because as we saw, Tantalus is the figure at the top, the first mortal figure in the family. So who is Tantalus? Maybe some of you have heard of him before, maybe some of you have not. He's never mentioned in the Iliad, though there are references to his family. So Achilles does tell the tale of Niobe to Priam and uses her story as an example of why humans have to eat even when they're grieving. But Tantalus is mentioned in the Odyssey, which is a text that we'll be reading next after we read the Oresteia. And in Book 11 of the Odyssey, the main character or hero of the epic, Odysseus, goes to the edges of the earth to perform a ritual that is kind of like an underworld visit, but essentially he summons the shades of the underworld to pass him in a parade through dark forms of magic. And during this time, he witnesses the underworld itself. Even though he's not quite going down to it, he's bringing it up to himself. In this context, we do have contact with Tantalus in the afterlife. And here is what Homer says that Odysseus says about seeing Tantalus in the underworld. This is from Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey that we'll be using this semester. So Odysseus is describing the landscape of hell, and he says, "I saw the pain of Tantalus, in water to his chin, so parched, no way to drink. When that old man bent towards the water, it was gone. Some god had dried it up, and at his feet dark earth appeared. Tall leafy trees hung fruit above his head, sweet figs and pomegranates and brightly shining apples and ripe olives. But when he grasped them with his hands, the wind hurled them away towards the shadowy clouds." So, Tantalus, his name is the source for the English verb tantalizing, because he is constantly tantalized by food hanging above him and an appetite that makes him want that food, and water below him, and reaching in both directions, he fails to achieve his his goal endlessly. So he was a wealthy king in Asia Minor. That was what he was up to during his life. He was, as I've mentioned, the son of Zeus. And we can think of Tantalus as belonging to a part of an very early generation of humans. As we've seen in other mythological texts that we've read, or texts that contain mythological material, we do have different ages in which human characters can be located. And Tantalus we can locate not in a particular golden or silver or whatnot age, but we can say that he's part of this early generation of humans who has slightly more interface with the gods. He has greater privilege and greater access to the gods than some other human characters in myth. And as a result of his sort of early human status, he enjoyed great wealth and privilege. And this, perhaps we can say, led to his hubris. Hubris is a Greek word that you may have heard before in context relating to classical material or just in general conversation. And in the Greek context, hubris the word refers to qualities of insolence, extreme violence, or arrogance. It can also mean outrage, injury, lust, and lewdness. So it's some sort of overbearing, arrogant way of being that can be violent and destructive as a result of this arrogance, which in Tantalus' case come from his wealth and his privilege and his not quite having a sense of humility as a mortal and his wish to sort of mess with and defy the gods. So how does this play out? What is Tantalus' hubris? So Tantalus wanted to test the gods' omniscience and cleverness. And because he was close with them, because he was one of these early humans who gets to traffic among the gods more often, he was dining with them, and at a banquet, he decided to serve his son, Pelops, as a main course. So let that sink in. Tantalus is providing the body of his son as food for the gods, and this is a test for the gods. So the gods all tell what's going on. They all understand the trick. They can discern what's going on in front of them, except for one of the gods who we haven't discussed much yet, but whom we'll read about later in the semester. The goddess Demeter, who's associated with grain and dry agricultural products. Demeter, who is also an emphatically maternal goddess, she is having a hard day on the day that Tantalus has this feast with the gods. And so she's distracted by the fact that her daughter, Persephone, has been abducted by Hades and is now, situated in the underworld with Hades himself. So Demeter is very distracted, very sad. And so she fails to notice that the food that she's eating is human flesh. So she has a few bites from Pelops' shoulder. Now the gods then realize what's going on, or have already realized what's going on, and they revive his dead, cooked body parts. But because Demeter has eaten some of his shoulder, they have to replace it. So Hephaestus makes a prosthetic shoulder out of ivory for Pelops, and he's brought back to life. Tantalus' payment. So I started telling you about what happens to Tantalus. His payment is that he stands in a pool of water, endlessly thirsty, but unable to reach the water. And he's hungry too, standing under fruit trees. But as every time he tries to reach the fruit trees, the food flees from him. So this is a time in this video where I want to invite you to perform some short reflections in your preferred method. So either written reflections in a free write or stream of consciousness, or just think or flip through the material and ponder, or free write, spending 3 minutes considering the connection between Tantalus' punishment, as I just discussed, and his crime. So what thematic connections can you see between how Tantalus is punished eternally in the underworld and what he did to instigate the gods' anger? The second reflection topic, after you've finished the first, is spend 3 minutes considering the connection between Tantalus's crime and the events of the Agamemnon. So how does child death or child sacrifice, or the eating of children perhaps in various ways, come through in the Agamemnon as a theme? And in what ways are Tantalus's crime palpable throughout the story of the Agamemnon, even though we're dealing with a much later generation in that family? How can we still sense the presence of Tantalus's crime in the events of the Agamemnon? So take 3 minutes or more reflecting on each of these before moving on with the rest of the video. Okay, so I mentioned this Pelops guy, and he was the revived son of Tantalus, who eventually migrated to southern Greece. He gave his name Pelops to the Peloponnese. And he was also a darling of Poseidon who taught Pelops how to ride and chariot horses. So Pelops is a very gifted charioteer, and he marries a woman who's depicted here named Hippodamia. She's the daughter of Oinomaus in Pisa. And later, I'm not going to go into it, there are a lot of shenanigans in this line that have to do with an Olympic chariot race as an early sort of iteration of the Olympics. And so if you're interested in that, please comment on the video and let me know that you'd like to hear more about the shenanigans and the chariot race that Pelops gets involved in. But I do want to skip ahead to the house of Atreus in its more immediate relatives to Agamemnon. So let's go back for a second, all the way to the family tree. Okay, so looking over it again, we've covered Tantalus, we've covered Pelops, and now we're looking at Thyestes and Atreus, who are brothers and the children of Pelops. So there are a lot of other children of Pelops too, but we're just focusing on these two, Thyestes and Atreus. And again, Thyestes is the father of Aegisthus. Atreus is the grandfather of Agamemnon. We're not really going to be talking about Agamemnon's father or mother, but just noticing that Thyestes and Atreus have tension, and Aegisthus and Agamemnon obviously do too. So let's go back ahead to see how that plays out. Oops. This is our last slide. Gonna make me go through all the way again. Hold on. Okay, there we go. So, Atreus and Thyestes, again, are the sons of Pelops. And Thyestes seduced Atreus' wife and stole a golden ram from him. This golden ram is actually a very important animal, and was supposed to be sacrificed to a god. So the fact that this this special golden ram that was supposed to be sacrificed to a god was then brought into an immediate family struggle where Thyestes is seducing Atreus' wife and then stealing the golden ram that Atreus had given to his wife and not allowing it to be sacrificed to the gods means that there's going to be some vengeance on its way. Atreus, as a result of what Thyestes has done, banishes Thyestes, later invites him back for a banquet. You should be very nervous about the phrase, or about the very word banquet in classical mythology, it appears. Because at this banquet that Atreus invited Thyestes back to, he served Thyestes' children, except for Aegisthus. So Thyestes had some other children at the banquet. Okay, so Thyestes is eating his children. He's had a Demeter moment. He's not a god, and he's also not, able to tell what the meat on his plate is. So he eats up his children. Once he realizes what he's done, because Atreus is like, ha ha, he curses Atreus. So he sends a very direct curse into the family on top of the intergenerational history of violence that already exists. There's now a direct invocation of a curse into the family that's going to play out in Agamemnon, and Cassandra, the prophetess, has seen a lot of this stuff firsthand. So Aegisthus we know from the play, is the surviving son of Thyestes. And it is this whole backstory between the parents, between Atreus and Thyestes, or grandparents, that creates the tension between Aegisthus and Agamemnon and makes Aegisthus want to team up with Clytemnestra to kill and depose Agamemnon. So if you want to see these events played out in dramatic form, there's a Roman tragedy called Thyestes by Seneca. So that would be a good piece of reading to learn more about this step in the generational strife. And now I just invite you to reflect on all of the intersecting, recurring, thematic acts of violence that work their way through this family and how to make sense of them. How do they connect with one another? How do they mutually illuminate one another? How do past acts of violence, sacrilege, how do these events recur sort of as a family trauma down the line? And what does the play tell us about family trauma and what can be done about it? So that's where I'll pause for today in our introduction to the Agamemnon via the greater context of the House of Atreus. But feel free to post your free write reflections so that others can see what you were thinking about earlier when I asked you to do 3 minutes of reflection on 2 different questions. So feel free to post that on this video and post any other questions or things you wanted to learn more about from the House of Atreus. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope you enjoyed learning about this bloody, bloody family.